Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take that pile of sources you give us and really distill them into something useful. Today, we're plunging into a really fascinating study about, well, how we read, and maybe more importantly, how we can all read a bit smarter. You've handed us a great piece of research here. It's from the Eurasian Journal of Applied Linguistics by Hassani and Pahamza, published back in 2022. So our mission today really is to unpack the connection between two big reading approaches, cognitive and metacognitive strategies. And we want to figure out how they actually impact reading comprehension and, vocabulary, especially for English as a foreign language learners, the EFL students in this study. Get ready for some, well, maybe surprising facts and definitely some practical takeaways you can use in your own reading.
Yeah, what's really compelling, I think, is how this research coming out of Indonesia helps us understand not just what makes someone a good reader, but kind of why certain strategies really make a difference. We'll try and connect these findings to, the bigger picture of how anyone really can get better at interpreting information.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The study focuses on these two main types, cognitive and metacognitive strategies. Can you give us the lowdown on what each one means? Maybe start with cognitive.
Absolutely. So think of cognitive strategies as the foundational building blocks. They're kind of the beginner's goals, maybe the first step in really acquiring reading skills. This involves directly, manipulating the learning material itself. Examples, things like predicting based on what you already know, taking notes to find the main ideas, maybe translating words you don't know, inferring meaning, or even transferring information to a new situation. Some people classify these as like rehearsal, elaboration, or organizational strategies. They help you test and confirm if you're actually getting it.
Okay, so if cognitive, the actual actions you take with the text is metacognitive, then more about the how or the why, like overseeing the process.
Precisely. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Metacognitive strategies are, well, they're considered higher order cognition. The simplest definition is basically thinking about one's thinking, or maybe knowing about knowing. It's that process where you actively regulate your own learning. So in reading, it means you're critically thinking about your understanding as you read. A really good example of metacognition in practice is just pausing sometimes and asking yourself, okay, do I actually get this? Or do I maybe need to go back and reread that last bit? It really brings up this key question. Are you aware of your own, cognitive experience while you're reading?
That makes a lot of sense. So it's about being actively engaged with your own brain during the process, not just passively taking words in. And the study highlights three key elements of these metacognitive reading strategies, right?
That's correct, yes. First, there's planning. This is before you even start reading properly. You sort of assess what you already know, what you don't, and importantly, what you need to get from this text. It involves choosing the right strategy and, crucially, having the motivation to want to improve.
Okay, planning first. What's next?
Second is active reading strategies. These are the things you do while you're actually reading. So making connections with your prior knowledge, making inferences, constantly checking if you're understanding. It's really a questioning mindset.
Right. Constantly checking in.
Exactly. And third, there are the fixing up strategies. This is what you do if you hit a snag, if something doesn't make sense. Instead of just pushing through, you might consciously slow down or maybe circle back to earlier paragraphs to look for context clues. This kind of continuous self-correction is what really builds those metacognitive skills over time.
So what does this all mean for the connection between the two?
Yeah.
How do cognitive and metacognitive work together?
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Metacognition is definitely a higher order skill, right? But, and this is key, it relies on having that domain-specific knowledge, the basic understanding, which comes from using those cognitive functions. You need something to think about.
Got it.
So the relationship between the two is just crucial, not just for reading, but for any kind of educational success or effective information processing. Lots of studies, including this one, have shown that good reading comprehension needs directed cognitive effort. But that effort is only really possible or truly effective when it's guided by metacognitive strategies. Basically, your metacognitive skills help you focus your attention, control your approach, and monitor the whole reading process. Makes everything more efficient.
Okay. Fascinating stuff. Now let's dive into the research itself. This study by Hassani and Pahamza, it looked at high school students in Serang, Indonesia. What was their main goal? What were they trying to find out?
Their primary goal was to determine how effective these cognitive and metacognitive strategies actually were, specifically how they impacted reading comprehension and vocabulary achievement among these EFL students. It was what's called a descriptive non-experimental study, so they were observing perceptions and attitudes as they were, not really manipulating variables like in a lab experiment.
Okay. And who were the participants? What was the group like?
The sample size was pretty decent, 450 students. They were from two senior high schools in an urban area selected through convenience sampling. It skewed female, about 67%, and also younger 60% were between 13 and 15 years old. And when they asked them why they read English texts, half of them, a full 50%, said it was mainly for improving grammar and vocabulary.
Interesting. And the others?
Getting good grades was next at 20%, then general awareness at 15%, and only about 10% said it was primarily for entertainment.
So, yeah, a big chunk were definitely reading to learn. But there was that surprising finding about their attitude towards research itself, wasn't there? That really jumped out at me.
Yes, it did. And it really raises an important question, doesn't it? Like, why might students approach learning in certain ways? They used something called the attitude towards research, or ATR scale, and the results were, well, pretty stark. A huge number of participants, 80%, 80, showed an unfavorable attitude towards research.
80%. Wow.
Yeah. It suggests there might be a real gap in how research is perceived, or maybe how it's integrated into their learning. It kind of hints that maybe, for many, learning feels more like a chore than, a tool for understanding.
Yeah, that's a huge percentage. It really makes you think. But, okay, despite that sort of background attitude, the study then went on to actually test the effectiveness of these strategies directly.
Yeah.
How did they do that? There was an experimental part.
Exactly. So they did pre-tests and post-tests with a smaller group, 60 students. They split them evenly. 30 in an experimental group, 30 in a control group. The experimental group got specific, targeted practice lessons for 4 weeks. They focused explicitly on teaching strategies like memorization techniques, text analysis skills, setting reading goals, thinking about pacing. Meanwhile, the control group just carried on with their usual conventional teaching methods.
Okay, 4 weeks of targeted practice versus business as usual. And the results. Did it make a difference?
Oh, absolutely. The difference was statistically significant. The experimental group showed, well, really significant improvement compared to the control group, and that was in both vocabulary and reading comprehension.
Can you give us some numbers?
Sure. For vocabulary, the experimental group's average score jumped from about 24.3 on the pretest to 32.25 on the post-test. The control group only nudged up slightly, and for reading comprehension, it was even more dramatic. The experimental group went from an average of 74.24 up to 101.15. Again, the control group saw only a much smaller gain.
Wow, those numbers really do paint a clear picture. That's quite an impact in just 4 weeks.
It really is, and if you look at it using something called a binomial effect size display, which is just a way to visualize the practical impact, the experimental group gained more than a 25% difference compared to the control group on both post-tests. That's a pretty remarkable improvement, especially for such a short intervention, just a few weeks. It strongly implies that the type of reading strategies you consciously apply makes a profound difference to your reading ability. There's a really strong link to understanding words and the overall context. It shows that deliberate practice really does work.
So, okay, let's connect the dots here. What does this all mean for us, for the listeners who want to become better, maybe more efficient readers? What are the practical takeaways?
Well, if we kind of zoom out to the bigger picture, it strongly suggests that consciously applying these metacognitive strategies, that thinking about your thinking can genuinely help you manage your learning process. It can help you overcome difficulties in reading comprehension and also really boost your vocabulary. The study basically says that with practice, and yeah, it takes time, but you can significantly improve your reading skills by deliberately using these strategies to not just decode text, but to really understand it and pick up new words from the context. The key insight, I think, is that it's not just about knowing stuff, it's about knowing how you know it and managing that process.
The study also mentioned a few specific techniques that fall under these broader umbrellas, didn't it? Could you maybe highlight those again? Give us a bit more detail.
Certainly, yeah. Beyond just cognitive and metacognitive as big categories, they reference specific things like scanning, reading really quickly just to find a specific piece of information, super useful for data collection or just deciding if a long text is even relevant.
Right, like looking for a name or a date.
Exactly. Then there's inferential reading. This is about going beyond the literal words, making educated guesses about the context, what the author is implying. It requires understanding the bigger picture, not just word-for-word translation.
Cool.
Paraphrasing was another one. Really useful when you hit a tough word or phrase. You stop, put in your own words. It might slow you down for a second, but it massively helps you actually learn and retain that vocabulary.
Yeah, I can see that being helpful.
And finally, they mention metaphase. This is kind of the deepest level. It's aiming for a much deeper meaning, understanding the author's intent, the context, how it all fits together, really getting the underlying message.
Those sound like really practical tools.
Yeah.
Now, the study also seemed to have some, let's say, strong opinions about the role of teachers in all this. What was the takeaway there?
It did, yeah. It highlighted a potential problem.
Hmm.
While these metacognitive strategies are incredibly valuable, classroom teachers often fall a bit short in actually fostering them. The direct teaching of these kinds of comprehension strategies is often pretty minimal or maybe just passive. So it raises this important question, how can we better equip educators? How can we train them in these metacognitive processes so they can effectively coach students in using reading strategies and building vocabulary? Seems like a gap in professional development, perhaps.
And it also touched on how the language itself might affect things, comparing Indonesian and English reading challenges.
Yes, that was an interesting point. It noted that learners of English often assume they can just guess the meaning of a word from the context around it, which
Mhm.
often works in English, right?
Mhm.
But apparently, for the Indonesian language, finding the direct meaning just through guessing context words might not work as well. So it implies you might need slightly different strategies depending on the language's structure.
That makes sense.
It also interestingly pointed out that learners seemed more likely to use metacognitive strategies when they were reading online texts. And maybe even that online reading could improve cognitive reading and study habits, too, helping readers become more active, more critical interpreters.
So, as we kind of wrap this up, what's the ultimate takeaway? If
Yeah.
someone wants to really boost their reading skills, what's the core message from the study?
I think the gist is that these metacognitive strategies are what really empower you to grasp the meaning of a text more easily, more deeply. The study strongly recommends introducing specific exercises, not just for students, but for any of us designed to help internalize meaning, and really focusing on using elaboration strategies actively, connecting new facts to what you know, linking main ideas with the details, constantly trying to integrate new information with your existing knowledge base. It's about building that mental model of the text, not just letting the words wash over you.
Yeah, this deep dive really drives home that reading is, well, it's far from passive, isn't it? It's truly an interactive process. It combines understanding the literal words on the page with that crucial layer of thinking about your own understanding of those words as you go.
Absolutely. And it really underscores that becoming a truly skillful reader involves that conscious, deliberate integration of both the cognitive effort doing the work and the metacognitive self-awareness managing the work. And yeah, it might require some extra practice, some extra time, but it's an investment that clearly pays off in deeper understanding.
So next time you're tackling a new text, could be a dense report, a complicated article, maybe just a story you want to really consider this. How might applying just a little bit more of that thinking about your thinking change things? How could it transform your comprehension, not just remembering words, but truly internalizing the meaning? What stands out to you from this discussion? Is there a specific strategy you might try out?
And remember, knowledge really is most valuable when it's understood deeply and you can actually apply it. There's always more to learn, and engaging with different perspectives, like this study offers, just enriches that whole process.
We certainly hope this deep dive helps you unlock even more insights from whatever sources you're working with. Until next time, keep digging.